Hey investor friends, I'm Michelle Markey, and today I'm going to review the top 5 investing books that teach us to invest like Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger. And in my late 20s, I discovered these books, and I wouldn't have come across them if I hadn't listened to the Invested podcast by Danielle Town and her father, Phil Town. And listening to them opened up a whole world of investing style that I learned could make a huge difference in our path towards financial freedom. And it's helped me get on a path of financial independence and retiring early movement, also known as FIRE. And I'm really happy to pass on the knowledge that I've gained from these books. The authors of these books are all disciples of Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger. And they're part of a really close-knit community of investors that want to invest in companies that will provide long-term value and deliver the kinds of returns that Buffett and Munger have enjoyed for a long time. And I want to clarify that sometimes in the investing community, people term this style of investing as value investing, and it could be a little bit of that, but that tends to get associated with mass market ways of understanding how this investment style is supposed to be about. And if you actually read some of these books or listen to the Invested podcast, you'll learn about how this goes a little bit deeper than your everyday idea of value investing. And the premise behind what these authors teach is founded on something that Warren Buffett says, which is rule number 1, never lose money, followed by rule number 2, don't forget rule number 1. And by no means are these authors offering a risk-free, guaranteed way to never lose money. That's definitely a reality we could all face when investing. It's still very possible to lose money when we're trying to invest. But by carefully evaluating companies according to investing criteria and the worldly wisdom from Buffett and Munger, we can greatly reduce our risk by knowing and understanding the companies, and we can increase our odds of having higher returns in the long run. Some people consider Benjamin Graham to be the grandfather of this style investing, but in my case, I actually consider Buffett and Munger to be my grandfather equivalent types, while people like Phil Town, Monish Pabrai, Guy Spear are like my uncles, and Danielle Town is like a really cool older cousin who gets this stuff. So I'm really excited to talk about what I got out of some of these books, and I really encourage you to go check them out for yourself. If you're not sure about buying these books, I encourage you to go to your local library and definitely borrow it, because that's a risk-free way to get really great knowledge and some useful ways that you could get started on this style of investing. As someone with a warrior expert personality type, I really appreciate how these books provide a step-by-step process and methodology to invest as closely like Buffett and Munger as possible. And these books empower us to become our own money managers. So I'm going to go through them one by one in the order of chronological publication. The first book is the 2006 Rule Number 1 by Phil Town. And this is still as relevant today as it was when it was first published 14 years ago. And in this book, Phil Town talks about his origin story, how he was a Grand Canyon river guide, and then he got on a path to becoming a really successful investor. And in this book, he outlines methods for evaluating wonderful companies that you can buy at attractive prices. And some of the ways in which he does this is by evaluating what's called the 4 M's, known as meaning, moat, management, and margin of safety. And he also reviews the 5 big numbers, which are growth rates that are used to measure the strength of the business. And although past performance is not a predictor of future success, it gives you some inkling on which to try to measure how likely is it that this company will continue to perform at these growth rates in the future. And some of these growth rate numbers include things like earnings per share, return on invested capital, sales, free cash flow, and book value or equity per share growth rates. And then he also uses something called the Rule of 72, which is the amount of money or a number that it takes to double in a certain amount of years if you divide it into the number 72. So for example, for some number to double, in 3 years, that would be growing at a 24% growth rate. So you take 72 divided by 24 to get the fact that this number will double in 3 years. So 72 divided by 24 is 3. In the year following rule number 1, in 2007, Monish Pabrai released The Dundo Investor. And Dundo means endeavors that create wealth. And this is a Gujarati Indian word that he talks about the Patel family having more than half of the motels in the United States. And it's a philosophy of making low-risk efforts that result in high-return investments. He likes to reiterate throughout the book, heads I win, tails I don't lose much. And to borrow from the MIT professor Ed Thorpe, and when it comes to odds and probabilities of winning a bet, he likes to make few, infrequent, big bets that will have low risk and will have high returns if the bets work out. Monish Pabrai embraces copycat investing in the Buffett and Munger style. And he even goes on to say Pabrai Funds is a shameless cloner of how Warren Buffett set up his partnerships before. And he reiterates the concept of margin of safety throughout the book, which means to buy an asset at a steep discount to its underlying value. And even if things in the future don't work out the best, the odds of having permanent capital risk are low. 3 years after that, in 2010, Philtown came out with Payback Time. And this book, if you learn nothing else from it, you need to know that price isn't necessarily equal to the value of a company. So the price you pay in the stock market isn't always equal to what the underlying value of a company really is. And this book goes deeper into the M's, like I mentioned before from his first book, and it gives you useful ways of calculating things like payback time, which is the measure of how soon you can expect to get your money back from an investment. And he also talks about the good and bad behind dividends. I know some fellow YouTube vloggers will say you want to buy companies that provide dividends, and he gives practical reasons why you may want to reconsider the purpose of dividends and if they're really a good or bad thing for you to receive as a retail investor. In the 2014 The Education of a Value Investor, Guy Spier talks about his origin story of how he went to elite schools like Harvard and Oxford and then got his start in Wall Street, where the philosophy was to place many eggs in many baskets. And gradually he gained exposure to people like Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger, who taught him many different things. So some of the things that Warren Buffett values include things like having an ecosystem of wanting to help other people, being a giver and not a taker. And gradually, Guy Spier met people like Monish Pabrai, who he found was also on a value quest to gaining worldly wisdom, just like Buffett and Munger. And over time, Guy Spier learned ways to adopt the ways that Warren Buffett invests, and also has an environment that's peaceful and not as rowdy like Wall Street can be. So Guy Spier lives in Zurich, and that's a pretty quiet place, just like Warren Buffett lives in Omaha, another quiet place to contemplate and understand companies so you can be a better investor. And one of the things that Guy Spier really emulates in Warren Buffett is Warren Buffett surrounds himself by people who reinforce and reflect his own values. And he also surrounds himself by people who he calls are smarter than him, like Charlie Munger. So Guy Spier just talks about how on this journey to becoming a value investor, it's an inner journey that he's trying to become the best person that he can be, and that he hopes will be fulfilling, and that will hopefully lead him to be a better investor in the end. Saving the Best for Last is the 2018 Invested by Danielle Town and Phil Town. And I love this book so much that I bought 2 editions of it, both the hard copy and paperback. And even the paperback has the limited edition misspelling of Warren Buffett or Warren Buffet. So I really relate to how Danielle grew up in life and some of her family relationships, and how she grew up getting college educated and getting a good job and working so hard, finding it difficult to accumulate wealth, and then kind of burning out, which I think is typical among us millennials. And She felt like there has to be a better way than just slaving away at a job. And part of what she did was turn to her father, who was this very knowledgeable investor, very successful, and she was willing to learn from him. So they started this podcast in 2015 and then came out with this book in 2018. So I'm super grateful that Danielle and Phil put this together for all of us to learn from their example. And some of what Danielle talks about is that investing is like a practice, like doing yoga. So if you think about doing an invested practice, that can be a really fun way to get into this idea of incorporating investing in our everyday life, just like we would exercise or doing yoga and meditation. And then Danielle builds on her father's previous books using the same principles and methodologies and updates them from a millennial perspective and using a millennial voice. And she talks about doing calculations to arrive at values of companies, such as doing a 10 cap valuation using owner earnings, or measuring payback time with free cash flow, and finding out the margin of safety based on earnings. And she also talks about voting with our money. So this idea of voting for the companies that we want in the future with our own money, that we want to see them thrive and grow and also continue to provide value both to us and our communities around us. I consider Danielle to be a great role model because she's really candid in saying how she was afraid of things like math and trying to apply what she thought were complex math equations to try to figure out valuations. But as she learned through it with her father, she came to find that some of these things really weren't so hard after all. And she can always reference her book to see how to do these calculations, and she doesn't have to commit them to memory. And even though personally I've not struggled with math in this kind of way, I've always really enjoyed math and using things like spreadsheets, which I know Phil also enjoys using spreadsheets. I know that embracing math and using these kinds of equations might be a little bit difficult, but I think Danielle breaks it down to an easy to understand way that I think everybody can use. And she also puts it conveniently in a sort of 12-month calendar, making it super simple to follow a pace of month by month learning to invest. So you can take it in your own time and take your time when learning how to invest. This book is the epitome of rule number 1 style investing. And just like Danielle is grateful for the challenges that were ahead of her that she needed to overcome in order to embrace a life towards financial freedom, I'm really grateful that people like Danielle Town, Phil Town, Monish Pabrai, Guy Spear, and Buffett and Munger exist on this planet to teach us how to be on the path towards financial freedom. So I'm really happy that I came across these books, and I really hope that you can also get something out of them so that you can also be on your own path towards financial freedom. And if you enjoyed this video or learned something, please like and subscribe or leave a question in the comments below. And I wish you well on your journey towards financial freedom. Thanks. Till next time.